Okay, so welcome back again to Existential Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be the sixth one in a series where we'll be exploring the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre. In the fifth video in this series, we discussed a bunch of different issues. Maybe one of the main ones is the intersection between the radical nature of human freedom and the creative call to invent and generate a unique and powerful life. The reason why I mention that is because we're going to be seeing that same theme again in this video. The game plan for this video is to go through Sartre's response to three primary complaints about existential thinking, and then get into a little bit of technical vocabulary we'll need to look at the sections from Being and Nothingness that are part of your reading assignment. So let's dig in. So, in The Humanism of Existentialism, which is the first part of your reading assignment, Sartre takes up what he feels are three principal complaints against existential thinking. So the first complaint is that existential thinking, and more specifically the kind of existential thinking that we've outlined thus far in this series of videos, promotes a kind of desperate quietism, is his phrase in translation. In other words, it generates a kind of paralysis or immobility, especially insofar as its analysis of freedom and responsibility makes those things seem so big and so deep and so overwhelming in a way that it becomes difficult to take action in a world. And of course, Sartre's prescription is ultimately existentialism is about an ethics of action and reality. So the complaint is that, well, that becomes very difficult when you have this particular way of viewing freedom as being fundamentally directionless, that ultimately any direction for our freedom is itself a product of our freedom. And the fact that that generates a very disorienting, dizzying, and directionless kind of sense for what our lives are about leads to a kind of paralysis which runs against the grain of his whole ethics of action and reality. Okay, so the question is, well, let's see. Maybe before we get to the question, I should emphasize once again something that I definitely emphasized in the last video, which is the idea that the paralysis results from the fact that ultimately freedom is directionless. Okay? In other words, there's no a priori basis for any of our choices. The only thing that serves as a basis for our choices or guidance for our choices is what we choose to regard as a basis or foundation for our choices. So ultimately what we're left with is nothing other than a reality composed of our ongoing choices and our responsibility for those choices. Okay, so now the question is, I felt like I had to review that for a second in case you sort of lost track of that. How does Sartre respond to that? Well, basically his response is that okay, so we are in a kind of existence where ultimately there is no a priori basis for our choices, but why would you choose to take that up as an occasion to be paralyzed? Because paralysis itself is a kind of choice. And the fact of the matter is, you could choose any number of different attitudes or responses to your existential reality, despite the fact that it's ultimately directionless, at least in the sense of a priori directions. And in other words, you could choose maybe to feel happy or excited or exhilarated by the challenge of it. And like we saw before in the last video, ultimately his exhortation is to create, to become the artist working on the blank page of time and space, which we're all given by the fact that we exist in human form. We're not just filling out a color by numbers book. This is a reference to the previous video. We're not just doing that. We're not just sort of filling in someone else's drawing, not God's drawing, not the drawing articulated by scientific principles, not the drawing articulated by prevailing social conventions or anything like that. That ultimately what it comes down to is that we're all given a blank canvas, and the task is to fill in that canvas of time and space and social relation and choices and responsibility and so on in some interesting, powerful, beautiful way. So he says in your reading assignment on page 45, yeah, you're free. So choose. That is, invent a life. create a life. Because the condition of your radical freedom is not necessarily just an occasion for paralysis or immobility or anything like that. You could choose a really different attitude toward it, maintaining a full lucidity and cognizant appraisal of the reality of your existential condition. So if that's the way it is, yes, become the artist of your existence. Create a meaning, create a direction. If life provides you with no a priori direction, then your task is to invent a direction for your life. If life provides you with no a priori meaning or sensibility or coherence to your life, then your task is ultimately an artistic task, to create and invent and fabricate a meaning for your existence. Okay, so the challenge of life is tougher than it seems like at first. He'll give you that. Yeah, it's a lot easier just to read a damn book or listen to some authority figure and say, well, there's the direction for my life, just to defer to some easy, ready-made answer. That's always going to be the easier thing to do, but life's challenge is way deeper than that. Okay? Life's challenge is ultimately to realize that any authority that you obey, you're choosing to obey, and that the reality of your freedom is the fundamental stratum upon which everything else is based. Same is true of scientific principles, and you may think, well, you know, scientific principles, there's more than just choosing scientific principles to believe in scientific principles. Well, here's the thing about that. Is there plenty of flat earthers out there who flout, basically, the edicts of the scientific cosmology and way of seeing reality? Okay, so you're free. So choose, invent, create a life. And for Sartre, that's the exact opposite of any kind of paralysis or desperate quietism. So the response to the charge of desperate quietism is that existentialism actually exhorts you to do the opposite of that, to take up the reins of your life in a much more fundamental way, a much deeper way, a much less superficial way than just deferring to any ready-made answer, no matter where it comes from. Okay, so the second complaint that he deals with has to do with something that you probably already have detected in our treatment of existentialism this semester, and that's that existentialism is too dark, gloomy, intimidating, scary, morbid, too emo maybe, or goth possibly. Like, it has this reputation for being kind of a dark modality of philosophy, or a scary modality of philosophy. And sort of the complaint is that, well, it's sort of too much that way. And his response to that is, well, you know, actually, it only seems dark because our prevailing social conventions are so skewed and imbalanced toward not recognizing the reality of how life is difficult and dark and scary and intimidating, that existentialism only seems dark because it's realistic. And we're hardly ever realistic about the nature of our existence. And it's that contrast effect between sort of our prevailing social conventions, which tend to make it rather impolite and rude to actually be honest and direct about how difficult and anxiety-provoking and uncertain life is. It's sort of like in the last video, I asked you to wonder whether you're free enough to be a serial killer. Well, that's not a polite question to ask people, you know. But from an existential point of view, it's an important sort of question. And a lot of existentialism emphasizes things like bad faith and anguish and anxiety and our relation to mortality. So it has this reputation as being sort of a dark or sort of goth. Maybe that's why I'm dressed all in black today, to sort of give you a sense for that. So existentialism has that reputation, but really Sartre's response to that is actually the animating spirit of existential thinking is to be realistic and to be direct and to be honest about how difficult and dark life actually is, that we're all composites of light and dark. Well, for most of us, it's a pretty easy task to sort of name and be honest about how the uplifting and positive side of life, but it's a much greater challenge to be honest and direct about how we're all bearers of darkness in various ways. Well, you know, it's no mark of shame to be a bearer of darkness if you're a human being, because it's inevitable. We all do it in various ways. And yeah, some people more than others, and some people in different ways than others, but we're all bearers of darkness. So maybe that's maybe that's the thing you might learn from this video. What'd you learn from the video? Did you watch the video like for existentialism class? Yeah, I did. What'd you learn? Like we're all ultimately bearers of darkness and there's no mark of shame about that. Okay, so a little quote from Sartre about this. So, well, first of all, let's introduce his phrase. Existentialism is about a kind of optimistic toughness, okay? It takes a kind of toughness to be honest and direct and forthright about how difficult and uncertain and scary and absurd life is, you know. But there's a kind of optimism, too, that we can still be honest about all of that and still live worthwhile lives, which hopefully you got a sense for in the complaint about the paralysis and desperate quietism. Like, if the challenge of life is to become the artist of your own existence, well, there's a kind of optimism in that, isn't there? You know, there is the potential for you to be honest and direct about how life actually is and still create something beautiful out of your existence. Anyhow, here's a quote from your reading assignment on page 48 about all that. So, a man is involved in life, leaves his impress on it, and outside of that, there is nothing. To be sure, this may seem a harsh thought to someone whose life hasn't been a success. But on the other hand, it prompts people to understand that reality alone is what counts. Reality alone, the reality of your life, the reality of your choices and responsibility is what really counts. So, you know, your utopian fantasies and sort of hopes and all that, dreams and all of this kind of stuff, okay, I guess to a certain extent that's inevitable in human affairs. But what really counts, ultimately, is what you live out, what you make of your life. The artist that you become or fail to become in the midst of your choices in an ultimately directionless sea of possibilities. Okay, so an optimistic toughness rather than a kind of pessimistic gloominess or something like that is Sartre's response. Okay, so the third complaint is something we looked at a little bit in the last video when we were looking at that business of, well, you know, one of the things that pisses people off about existential ethics, at least the Sartrean version of existential ethics, is that it seems to leave very little room for appraising or judging other people in an ethical or moral way. Okay, and what we saw in one of the previous, I think it was the last one, it might have been the one before that. I did 3 videos that day, so I'm a little hazy about what we talked about in which videos. But at any rate, the complaint is that there's not enough room in this vision for ethical, moral judgment of other people. And the reason why is because this is not a behavior-driven ethics. Okay, so if you have a behavior-driven ethics that says, well, behaviors 1, 2, and 3 are the good ones, and behaviors A, B, and C are the bad ones, then it becomes relatively easy to make ethical, moral judgments of other people. You just match their behaviors to the paradigm of behaviors that are coded as good, as opposed to the ones that are not coded as good, and sort of your ethical judgment sort of comes out automatically from all of that. So let's recall that for Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir also, ultimately, existential ethics, it revolves around this issue of good and bad faith. So the ethical question really is, are you owning your freedom as your freedom, and are you willing to take full responsibility for it? That's really what ethics is ultimately about. It's not a matter of coding certain behaviors as good ones and certain behaviors as bad ones. Even you know, in behavior-driven ethics, like you know, one of the deepest behavior-driven ethical mandates is probably thou shalt not kill. Well, the thing about that, it seems straightforward at first, but the fact of the matter is that there are all sorts of exceptions to it, really. You know, like for instance, well, if you kill in self-defense, is that still like a ethical evil in some way? Well, our prevailing customs say no, at least in the United States where I live, say no, that you're allowed to kill in self-defense. Well, what about like in war? You know, if you have to go to war with another nation, and war almost always involves killing at some level, well, is that going to be coded as ethically evil, or should you let the totalitarian dictators and bullies of the world just run roughshod over everyone else because thou shalt not kill? Thou shalt not kill the totalitarian dictators and bullies of the world or their soldiers they're sending to invade your country. Well, there again, the obvious answer is, well, you know, killing is justified in certain sense. So, and I'm bringing this up to make you, no, well, not make you, to invite you to question whether behavior-driven ethics are really all that it's cracked up to be. Because, you know, the water is almost always muddy in the ethical realm. Okay, so Sartre's response to this complaint that, well, there's not enough room for ethical or moral judgment of others because you're not offering up an easy, cut and dry, behavior-driven ethical system for us. Instead, it's going to be revolving around this issue of good and bad faith. Now, what Sartre says, he has a two-sided response to this. He says, like, yeah, we're not doing behavior-driven ethics here. He's upfront and honest about that. But he also says that it's possible to make logical inferences about whether someone is or is not in good faith or not. All right, so, like, there is a kind of room for judging people in a moral, ethical way, but once again, it's going to be revolving around your perception of whether the other person is in good or bad faith or not. Incidentally, you might play with this as you watch the political actors on the stage, the world stage, if you live in the United States, on the world stage these days. So he has this double-sided response to it, that on one hand, yeah, this is not behavior-driven ethics. On the other hand, you still can, in a way, evaluate other people's ethical position with regard to their logical consistency vis-a-vis the whole question of whether they're in good faith or not. Okay, and by the way, that's where this category of cowards and stinkers we already talked about comes up. All right, so that's the first part of this video. And the second part is going to be a kind of transition phase into exploring the section from being and nothingness that's in your reading assignment that is about the desire to be God. But before we talk about that section itself, we probably need to dose you on a bunch of vocabulary that appears in that excerpt from Being and Nothingness so that you can actually understand it. So the next bit of material in this video is basically going to be a glorified vocabulary lesson. Okay, so a little bit of vocabulary from Being and Nothingness. So in Sartre's phenomenological treatment of being, to be found in Being and Nothingness, basically he makes relatively early on a distinction between two kinds of being. Okay, so one of those kinds of being is he calls being in itself. That's the English translation, or in a shorter phrase, the in itself. Okay, so when he's sort of talking about the in itself, it's one of the two, well, actually there are going to be three ultimately, but at first let's say there are two modes of being, and it's the kind of being that objects have. So inanimate objects in the material world, like, oh, I don't know, boxes of Kleenex or something like that, or funny cowboy hats. So here's an example of the in itself. All right, so the kind of being that objects have. Now, the way he thinks about the kind of being that objects have, or the in itself, let's start to use your new vocabulary as we're explaining this. The in itself is about a pure fullness of being, that objects are just there in a sort of pure and full way. Okay, so that's a way of characterizing the in itself, or en soi, if you want the French for it. Okay, so sometimes they retain the French language. Okay, and the other kind of being is going to have a different phrase. So this is going to be being for itself. Excuse me, I might have to sneeze any second here. Or also known as the for itself. In French, the pour soi. Okay, so this is consciousness. All right, so one of the central constructs in Being and Nothing, probably the central construct in Being and Nothingness, is consciousness. So in a way, being in nothingness sort of is a throwback to Husserlian phenomenology. Okay, so the earlier form of phenomenology generated by Edmund Husserl, so pure or transcendental phenomenology. So in a way, Sartre is going to be speaking some of that same sort of language, and it's the language of consciousness. So let's take a few terms from Husserl that'll help you understand, hopefully, part of what the for itself is doing. So the for itself, once again, let's remind ourselves of what that means. That's consciousness, the kind of being we have, conscious being. All right, we're not just like objects. There's something else going on in our state of being. Okay, so from Edmund Husserl, so Husserlian means from Edmund Husserl, this guy who formulated an earlier version of phenomenology upon which Sartre's is based, had the idea, well, actually he took this from an earlier thinker yet, that consciousness is fundamentally actional in nature. In other words, it's a doing of something. Okay, so consciousness is not like a bucket into which perceptions are thrown. Okay, that was an earlier idea of what consciousness is about. It's like, well, it's just sort of a container for our perceptions, and the container can organize our perceptions or something like that. Well, Husserl, taking an idea from another earlier thinker whose name was Franz Brentano, had the idea that consciousness is ultimately a doing. It's a kind of doing. It's actional in nature. So consciousness is a kind of doing, that consciousness is intentional in nature, and the word intentionality is meant to denote this doing aspect, but also the referential aspect. Okay, so here's the second part of consciousness, that consciousness is always referring to something. Okay, so dream consciousness is about a dreaming, that's the noesis side, and it is also referring to something, a particular dream, that's the noema side. Okay, so introducing two, well, Greek words that Husserl uses. So noesis means that consciousness is doing something, noema means that it's also referring to something at the same time. And those two combined are what is known as the intentionality of consciousness. So Sartre takes up that idea too when he's thinking about what makes the for itself the for itself. Now, here comes the biggest counterintuitive trick. All right, we might have to spend a little bit of time on this next one. That what consciousness, or the for itself, is actually doing has a negative kind of character to it. Okay, it's going to be doing a kind of negation. And at first it seems like, how could that possibly be true? That the central actional nature of consciousness is going to be about a kind of negating. Now, let's expand the vocabulary of negating out first before explaining it to you, so maybe you can start to understand it. More to the point, the for itself, because its essential nature has to do with a kind of negating, is going to be the active production of nothing. And at first it's probably sounding like a damn riddle or something like that. In other words, the for itself is itself a kind of nothingness, a kind of no thingness. And by that, what Sartre means is that, well, the for itself is different from the kind of being of the in itself, the kind of being that objects have. So the for itself is not a thing, so it's no thing, and at the same time, consciousness is operating according to this negative principle, this ongoing production of nothing or no thingness. All right. So a more technical way of saying that would be, it's what it is doing is nihilating. Okay. So nihilating means the ongoing production of nothing. Okay, and it comes from the Latin nihil, which is the Latin word that means nothing. So nihilating means the active, ongoing production of nothing. And at this point, we need to turn our attention toward helping you understand how that could possibly be. Like, why would he say such a thing? You know, because it's probably counterintuitive as hell if you're hearing this for the first time, especially. Now, to help you get a handle on this, the question is, well, how is it that in your perceptual field, so perceptual consciousness is one kind of consciousness, all right? So let's look at perceptual consciousness, because it's the one that probably you're in a lot of the time, and the first one you think of when you think of conscious activity. How is it that perceptual consciousness is able to make distinctions between things within your perceptual field, that you're able to perceive a hat, visual aid. We try to keep our experiments really simple in this class. So like a hat is distinct from a laptop in your perceptual field, is distinct from a phone in your perceptual field, which is distinct from another pair of glasses. I'm getting a little bit of exercise in this video. Maybe I can drop some of the weight I put on during the semester. Like, how is it that consciousness is able to make those sorts of distinctions? Well, Sartre's insight is that, well, those distinctions are made according to a negative principle. What keeps this hat being distinct from everything else in your visual field, let's say in this video, this red chair behind me and so on, is that it keeps persistently not being other things it possibly could be in your imagination. So what keeps this hat in your perceptual field being this hat is that it persistently refuses to become this chair. It is not a laptop. It is not a shirt. It is not a coronavirus haircut conducted in the middle of my kitchen. It is not a video you're watching. It is not the lights up above. It is not whatever, another visual aid. It is not a box of Kleenex, okay, etc. I'm sort of enjoying physical activity. One of the tough things about making this videos is I can't walk around and be, you know, sort of physically manic the way I normally am in class. It's sort of I'm pinned to this chair. Okay, but that's not the point. The point is that consciousness operates by a kind of negative principle that allows it to make distinctions between things. And consciousness is always about making distinctions in things because consciousness is ultimately referential. You getting it? That your perceptual consciousness, your intentionality of your consciousness is about ongoingly distinguishing this hat from everything else in your visual perceptual field. The same thing is true of how it is that the for itself distinguishes itself from everything else in the world. Okay, so this negative principle, this nihilating principle, is operating across two dimensions. First of all, it's what allows consciousness, or the for itself, to make distinctions within what it is perceiving, but it's also what allows the for itself to distinguish itself from everything else. Okay, so consciousness is a no-thingness, an ongoing production of nothing or annihilating, and hopefully, because this is such a damn slippery idea, hopefully you're getting a little bit acclimated to it by way of this. Okay, so annihilation, the activity of no-thingness, is for Sartre the definitive characteristic of the for itself. That's how I told it to you in your notes. Ultimately, consciousness is an ongoing annihilating, and that's what makes it different from the in itself. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. So this in itself, which we characterized earlier as a full sort of presence of being, or a fullness of being, is very different from the for itself, whose central operating principle is the ongoing production of nothing that allows distinctions to be made within its perceptual field and also allows it to distinguish itself from everything else in the universe. Okay, so that's a thought that maybe you might have to think about a little bit. So I'll give you a little bit of time to chew on that. I'm going to end this video pretty soon. Maybe here's a thought. Like, for those of you who have maybe read something about Saussurean structural linguistics of the early 20th century, in a way there's a sort of similar distinction that Saussure makes between how signifiers are able to point to one another, and for him that happens partly by way of a negative process also. So okay, so we're ending this video just in time because the camera just shut off to tell me, like, hey, don't be a hyper loquacious professorial dope like you usually are and go on too long about things. So here's the last thought. Like, I always sort of wondered about whether Sartre somehow got this idea from Ferdinand de Saussure and his early 20th century version of structural linguistics. Okay, that was the last thought I was trying to finish. Anyhow, hope you're having a great day. Hope you're surviving your quarantine in some kind of positive fashion. I'll be with you pretty soon, I think this afternoon, with another video. In any case, until then, stay safe, stay healthy. God bless you. Take care. Bye-bye.